Hello and welcome to the History of the Germans, episode 165, Wenceslas the Lazy and Ruprecht of the Empty Pocket, which is at the same time episode 2 of season 9, The Reformation Before the Reformation. Quote, "And since these especially ruinous harms to all of Christendom are not to be tolerated or suffered any longer, so we have completely agreed, with a well-considered disposition, by means of much and various discussion and counsel, which we have earnestly undertaken concerning this among ourselves and with many other princes and lords of the Holy Empire, for the assistance of the Holy Church, the comfort of Christendom, and the honour and profit of the Holy Empire, that we want fully and specifically to remove and depose the above written Lord Wenceslas, as a neglectful procrastinator, dismemberer, and one unworthy of the Holy Empire, for the same Holy Roman Empire and all the dignities pertaining to it, with immediate effect." End quote. So concluded the Prince Electors of Cologne, Mainz, Trier, and the Palatinate on August 20th, 1400. King Wenceslas, counted as the fourth of his name, son of the great Emperor Karl IV, King of Bohemia and Duke of Luxemburg, was to be deposed for his evil deeds and afflictions that are so clearly manifest and well known throughout the land that they can neither be justified nor concealed. End quote. How could that happen? Last time we looked at the House of Luxemburg, they directly held almost a quarter of the German lands, controlled 2 of the 7 electoral votes, had maneuvered themselves into pole position to gain the Hungarian and the Polish crown, with even a long-term option on Austria, Styria, Carinthia and Tyrol. But now, a mere 22 years later, the great Second Carolingian Empire lies in tatters. How was that possible? Well, that is what we will look at today. But before we start, I want to thank all of you for your unwavering support throughout these almost 4 years. Without your encouragement and support, this show would have ended up on the pile of discarded podcasts long time ago. And I'm particularly excited about the recognition this humble effort is receiving from the academic community. Specifically, I want to thank Professor Duncan Hardy, who has given me an advanced look at his forthcoming book on law, society and political culture in the medieval and Reformation Germany, which is the source of the quotations at the top of this episode and which will appear regularly throughout the upcoming episodes. Thank you so much. And at the same time, I want to thank my patrons who have been so kind to sign up on patreon.com/historyofthegermans or have made one-time donations at historyofthegermans.com/support. If you want to join them, you can do so for the price of just a latte per month. But make sure you sign up from anything but your iPhone, as the evil kneecappers at Apple will charge you an additional 30% from November if you do so. Special thanks today go to Chris E.J., Gilles L., John Thompson, Peter McCloskey, Martin Engelmann, and Jim V., who've already signed up. And with that, back to the show. And when I say back, we go all the way back to November 29, 1378. Emperor Karl IV lay on his deathbed, surrounded by his family and in particular his eldest son Wenceslas. Though Karl was an old man by the standards of his time, he was 62 years old when he passed, he only had his sons quite late in life. Wenceslas, the eldest, was 17. His half-brothers Sigismund and Johann were 10 and 8 years old. Apart from the 3 boys, there were 3 sisters. Catherine, much older than the boys and married to Rudolf IV of Austria, plus Anne and Margaret, both still children. There were also some elder members of the House of Luxemburg, Karl's brother Wenzel, the Duke of Luxemburg and Brabant, and Karl's nephews, Jobst and Prokop of Moravia. Now, if we disregard Wenceslas' age, this is a pretty good setup from a dynastic point of view. Enough spare males to continue the family line should something untoward happen, and 2 unmarried sisters to deploy for diplomatic gain. Those of you who've listened to the last season will not be surprised to hear that Karl IV thought long and hard about this constellation and set everything up for success. For one thing, he had given the younger sons enough assets and tasks to keep them from clashing with their older half-brother. Sigismund was engaged to Maria, the daughter and heiress to the kingdoms of Hungary and Poland, two of the largest and most difficult to manage monarchies in the whole of Europe. On top, he was given the Margraviate of Brandenburg, a land ravaged by decades of civil war that may need a lot of TLC, but came with the most valuable electoral vote. The youngest, Johann, was given a modest duchy centered on the city of Görlitz, enough to live comfortably, but not enough to be a challenger to his brothers. His job was to support one of the other two, and being the spare should some unexpected harm befall any of them. But most importantly, Karl IV had removed all obstacles previous sons of emperors had to deal with. Wenceslas had been crowned King of Bohemia when he was barely 3 years old. At the age of 15, he was elected and crowned King of the Romans, an exercise that had cost his father literally millions. Money he raised by handing over almost all that was left of the already much diminished resources attached to the royal title to the imperial princes. Hence, when his father died, Wenceslas immediately stepped up into the role of ruler of the empire. No tense election, no further bribes, and no civil unrest. Just a smooth transition from father to son. The last time that had happened was almost 200 years ago, in 1190, when Henry VI took over from Frederick Barbarossa. And when Wenceslas came into the office on Monday after the funeral, all was ready for him. His father's advisors, some of whom had been with the House of Luxemburg for decades, were happy to serve the young king. The Chancery, the office that kept the records and managed the correspondence, was one of the most experienced and most efficient in medieval Europe. The territories he ruled directly and that he could rely on for money and military resources were the richest and largest princely territories in the empire. What could possibly go wrong? Well, everything. What Karl IV could not protect his son from were the circumstances. And as Herodotus once said, circumstances rule men, men do not rule circumstances. Now, you may counter with the great Eastern philosopher Bruce Lee, who famously said, "To hell with circumstances, I create opportunities." But here's the difference. Karl IV had been a Bruce Lee. Wenceslas was not. Much's been said and written about little Wenceslas, most of it less than flattering. But when he was 17, he was one of Europe's most accomplished young monarchs. He spoke multiple languages, had been tutored by some of the finest minds in the kingdom, including Johann von Jenstein, the Bishop of Meissen and later Archbishop of Prague, and his father had involved him in imperial politics from a very young age. And now this well-trained and well-set-up young man was confronted with some of the most intractable problems of the already quite challenging 14th century. Two of these problems were unfinished business left to him by his father, and a further two had hit the in-tray more recently. Now, let's take them one by one. First up is the thorny issue of the general peace, the Landfrieden. As so often in history and current affairs, everybody wants peace, but not everybody wants the same peace. Karl IV and now Wenceslas wanted a peace led by imperial institutions, meaning a structure where the imperial court and an imperial enforcement mechanism ensured that the roads and rivers are safe to travel on, feuding was stopped, and virgins, widows, and orphans remain unmolested. The cities liked the idea of safe roads and all that, but they were worried that the imperial courts and their police forces would be staffed with knights and princes rather than their own people. Plus, so far, no general peace had materialized despite decades of trying. Instead, the robber barons still stole all that was left of a trader's wares after the extortionate princely tolls had been paid. So, the cities preferred to organize their own protection by forming leagues. First the Swabian League, then the Rhenish League, and finally the Saxon League. Now the princes, too, liked safe roads and rivers and all that, but would very much like to have their judges and their forces providing that peace. That would give them both the court fees and a hold over the cities to better shake them down for cash. And then finally, there are the knights, squeezed financially by the fallout of the Black Death, diminished socially by changes in military tactics, and pushed around by both princes and cities, had resorted to robbery and feuding to make a living. So, I stand corrected. Not everyone wanted peace, particularly not the knights. And to defend their ancient rights to plunder and robbery, or freedoms as they called it, they had formed knightly associations, like for instance the Jürgenschild in Swabia. The second leftover issue was how to organize the Kingdom of Bohemia. As I have been repeating to total exhaustion, being king of the Romans came now with almost no resources. Hence, to be an effective king of the Romans and later emperor, one needed their own territories in good order. Good order mainly means structured in a way that it produced enough coin to hire mercenaries, bribe electors, and pay off competing claims. For Wenceslas, that meant he needed to turn the bundle of feudal rights he had inherited into something that we would recognize as a state. So, not a medieval kingdom that worked through a cascade of personal obligations, but one where everybody below the king was a subject. This is what every monarch in Europe and every prince in the empire was trying to get to. Karl IV had made a move into this direction in 1355 with his ambitious law code, the Majestas Carolina, but that project had to be almost immediately abandoned in the face of baronial opposition. Bohemia was a particularly difficult place to introduce such a modern structure, in inverted commas. In Bohemia, the great magnates, the barons, held their land free and unencumbered. They weren't vassals of the king, and as such they administered justice in their lands, and if taxes were imposed, they kept as much as 60% of the funds raised for themselves. Bohemia was run by a committee comprising the 4 great offices of state and the king, and that committee met 4 times a year. These 4 great offices were usually staffed by members of the baronial class. And within the committee, the king was just the first amongst equals. The only areas where the king had sovereign authority was over his vassals, who controlled a relatively small proportion of the kingdom's territory, his own estates, and the Bohemian church. Now Karl's father, the blind King John of Bohemia, had clashed with the barons and had ended up being forced to submit to their power. Karl too was unable to shift the formal structure, but by using his charm and cunning and his elaborate concept of the crown of Bohemia as a separate entity from the king as a person, he had been able to extract money, soldiers, and even occasional concessions from the barons. Wenceslas wanted to keep pace with rival dynasties in the empire, and hence he believed he needed to break the power of the barons and streamline Bohemia along French or English lines. Now we come to issue number 3, the Papal Schism. For once, this was neither Karl's nor Wenceslas' fault, but it was still Wenceslas' problem. As the schism became ever more intractable, with Europe being split down the middle between the supporters of the Roman and the Avignon pontiff, the people were looking for an authority that could resolve the issue. And in search of an arbiter, public opinion harked back to the olden days, when the emperor had been the shield and protector of the church. That concept may have dropped into the executioner's basket when young Conradine's head was forcibly removed from his body, but now that the world was in such dire straits, it was time to call the emperors back to their holy duty. As if that was not enough, there was also complication number 4, the dying of the great kings. It began with the death of Casimir the Great of Poland in 1370, Waldemar Atterdag of Denmark in 1375, Edward III of England in 1377, then there's obviously the Emperor Karl IV in 1378, Charles V the Wise of France in 1380, and Louis the Great of Hungary in 1382. All these had been towering figures in European history. But their successors were either young, like Richard II and Wenceslas, female, like Jadwiga of Poland and Maria of Hungary, or, most devastatingly, suffering from serious mental health issues, as was the case with Charles VI of France. The succession crises this caused all across Europe created distractions that prevented the main actors from focusing on the great calamity that was the schism. And, closer to home, neighbors were dragged into protracted civil wars. In Wenceslas' case, that was the succession to the Hungarian and, to some degree, the Polish throne. Lots to do for the young hero of this episode. Things are actually off to a reasonable start. Wenceslas proposed a concept for his general peace at his first diet in 1379. There was not as much resonance as he may have hoped for, but it might have been the beginning of something. The problem was that the different parties, the cities, the princes, and the knights disagreed with each other on everything, except for one thing, which was that they did not want what Wenceslas wanted. In 1384, a peace was actually concluded between the princes and the cities, called the Heidelberger Stallung, which Wenceslas then rejected. About 3 years later, Wenceslas' chancellor did endorse this solution, though we do not know where the king really stood himself. Wenceslas was politically closer to the cities, in large part because that is where his parsnip was buttered. Of all the sources of income for a king of the Romans, the city taxes were the only things left. But the cities did not want him. So when he was trying to make himself the head of one of the city leagues, the Swabian League specifically, well, they turned him down. And that upset young Wenceslas, but he did what he usually did in this situation, which was nothing. Despite the Heidelberger Stallung, conflict between the princes and the cities over how the peace was to be ensured worsened, leaving in the end only a military solution. And that happened on August 23rd, 1388, at Döffingen, where a princely force, led by Count Eberhard of Württemberg, routed the forces of the Swabian City League. 3 months later, the princes defeated the Rhenish City League as well. But, though they had won, the princes failed to impose their solution onto the country. The war had exhausted their resources. At which point Wenceslas could step in and declare his general peace at Eger, Chep in Czech, which sets out that, quote, "It has been agreed, and we desire this before all other things, that when people travel through the Holy Empire, or the areas encompassed by this land peace, all roads, churches, monasteries, parsonages, churchyards, mills, and especially all ploughs with horses, and that which belongs to them, and vineyards, and fields, and all things agricultural, should be safe and be left in peace, and that nobody should attack, injure, or damage them. And should anyone contravene this, it should be treated as robbery, and the land peace should proceed against them as is written above." The empire was divided into 7 circles, each led by a superior officer appointed by the king, and the officer would convene courts drawn from the cities and princes to adjudicate. That is a great result, one that had eluded his great father. Okay, he got there because the other parties were exhausted, so not exactly all his doing, but then success is success, so congrats Wenceslas. Unfortunately, that was the only bit of his reign that warrants congratulations. Because let's move to agenda item number 2, the Great Western Schism. What was Wenceslas' contribution there? Well, sort of nothing, I'm afraid. The problem was that for him to have the authority to resolve the schism, Wenceslas needed to be either a magnetic personality that everyone was willing to defer to, or he needed to at least hold the imperial crown. Wenceslas had neither. The personality issue was again not exactly his fault. The lack of an imperial crown, however, sort of was. He had made multiple attempts to gather the funds for an imperial Rumzug to get crowned by Urban VI and then later Urban VI's successor. But all of these efforts came to naught. And the reason lay in part in his lack of drive and also in his ability to make a right old mess of the other 2 problems, the general peace and the reorganization of Bohemia. And whilst these problems remained at the forefront of royal policy, Rome had to wait. And whilst Christendom was waiting for the king of the Romans to get down to the Tiber, the schism became worse and worse. Again and again did the princes demand that Wenceslas take the lead in resolving this fundamental crisis of Christianity. But he was dithering. He was officially a supporter of the Roman Pope, by now Benedict XIII, but when Benedict called upon him to protect him against Neapolitan incursions sponsored by the French and the Avignon popes, he failed to come for help. Why? Maybe because he did not want to annoy the French, or maybe because he simply did not know what the right course of action was. This lack of decisiveness, the constantly shifting of allegiances without rhyme or reason, was first confusing and then deeply irritating to his negotiation partners. So, what did he do all this time from 1378 to 1400? Well, mostly he tried to bring Bohemia to heel. His father had coalesced the Bohemian magnates around the idea of the Bohemian crown as a sacred object representing the kingdom itself. And the barons were much more amenable to the idea of serving the kingdom and its patron, Saint Wenceslas, than serving the person of the king and emperor. What Wenceslas lacked was the ability to maintain and exploit that elaborate intellectual structure. Instead, he took the barons head-on. He watered down the role of the Committee of the Four Great Offices of State that ran the country. He did that by creating new offices that took over some of the committee's responsibilities. Then he staffed these new offices with loyal servants recruited amongst the lower nobility and even foreigners. Another move was that he claimed the right to seize lands of barons who had died without legitimate offspring. That was customary in the case of vassals all across Europe, but a terrible infringement on the ancient rights of the free Bohemian barons who insisted not to be vassals. Things got even more heated when Wenceslas got into a quarrel with the Archbishop of Prague, his old tutor and advisor, Johann von Jenstadt. This quarrel was, as so often, over land and privileges. It reached boiling point when Wenceslas attempted to create a new bishopric separate from the Archbishopric of Prague and staffed by one of his creatures. The Archbishop countered this plan by electing someone else for the intended role. Wenceslas had one of his famous tantrums and had one of the Archbishop's deacons, Johann Nepomuk, arrested. Wenceslas then had Nepomuk tortured most cruelly, a process he seemingly had participated in personally. And finally, he had the severely injured prelate tied up and thrown off the Charles Bridge in Prague. Nepomuk was canonized in 1721 and became the patron saint of Bohemia and the protector against floods and droughts, which is why you find his statue on so many bridges in Catholic Germany. The murder of Johann Nepomuk was a horrific crime that shocked most of Europe, was later cited as one of the key reasons for his deposition, and it pushed the Bohemian barons over the line. The question is why Wenceslas, who wasn't a stupid man, did it. By 1393, when that happened, the king had badly deteriorated physically and mentally. He had suffered a severe illness in 1388, and what made things worse was that his physicians recommended regular intake of alcohol to improve his humus, a prescription that sent this already fragile individual down a path to severe alcoholism. In 1393, he narrowly survived a poison attack that further paranoid him. The barons presented their grievances to the king, and when he refused to acknowledge them, they formed the League of Noble Lords, with the aim to gain control of the main offices of the kingdom again, if need be, militarily. Wenceslas turned to his half-brother Sigismund, the King of Hungary, for help, and the two signed an agreement to make each other the heirs to their respective kingdoms should one of them die without offspring. That pushed Wenceslas' cousin, the Markgraf Jobst of Moravia, over the edge, because Jobst had just spent some fine gold to become the recognized heir to Wenceslas. And in his anger, Jobst joined the League of Bohemian Noble Lords, and they all took Wenceslas prisoner and sent him to an Austrian jail for safekeeping. That turned out not to be such a great idea, because the Duke of Austria was persuaded by imperial princes, led by Ruprecht of the Palatinate, to let Wenceslas go. Once Wenceslas returned to Bohemia, he acted like the proverbial elephant in the china shop. He arrested his cousin Jobst of Moravia and had a number of his enemies executed. His brother, Johann of Görlitz, pretty much the only member of his family he could trust, was appalled and left his side. The whole thing could have resulted in a massive civil war, had it not been for some fortuitous deaths, including that of his brother Johann from unexplained poisoning. His other brother Sigismund came in as a white knight and negotiated a fragile peace between Wenceslas, the noble lords, and cousin Jobst of Moravia. And that peace was indeed fragile. In 1397, Jobst had several of Wenceslas' advisors murdered, and the lords kept Wenceslas cut off from the revenues of the kingdom. And with this, we are now gradually heading into the fateful year 1400. But before we get there, just a few words about the problem number 4, the succession to the great kings. We will go through the ins and outs of that in later episodes, but the important point for Wenceslas was that it incapacitated all the major monarchies in his neighborhood, France, Poland, Hungary, and England. And he needed them to deal with the key challenges, in particular the schism. Moreover, his brother Sigismund was deeply involved with the Hungarian succession, which drained Wenceslas' coffers and took up a lot of headspace. As a consequence, his foreign policy became increasingly erratic, swinging back and forth between France and England, where the 100 Years' War had resumed. In one of his worst miscalculations, he made Gian Galeazzo Visconti, the ruler of Milan, a duke. This might have been intended to smooth his way down to Rome in the hope to finally get the imperial crown, but it had the opposite effect. The other Italian states, Venice, Florence in particular, were extremely concerned about this improvement to their rival status, and hence blocked any attempt for Wenceslas to move south. Equally, the imperial princes were appalled that such a parvenu and ruthless dictator was admitted to their exclusive club without their consent. And that's where we are in the year 1397. Now, the last time Wenceslas had shown his face in the empire had been 10 years earlier, 1387. Since then, 10 years of nothing. Diets had taken place in his absence and had sometimes been called without his permission. Even when he was asked to appoint an imperial vicar to deal with the most pressing affairs in his absence, he had either not responded or appointed members of his family who too were far too busy with other things. The Landfrieden, the general peace, his great achievement of the 1380s, had not been extended and was effectively null and void. He was embroiled in Bohemian and Hungarian affairs. But the worst accusation was that he had not resolved the schism, not even made any viable effort to resolve it. The empire, represented by the Prince Electors, concluded that they had no king. Wenceslas made one last-ditch attempt to save his imperial crown. He called a diet in Frankfurt over Christmas of 1397. But that backfired badly. Wenceslas' solution to the schism was to join a French plan to depose both popes and elect a new one. The imperial princes told him in no uncertain terms that if he did that, they would depose him right there and then. He nevertheless travelled to Reims to negotiate with the French. Another catastrophe. He was stinking drunk most of the time and agreed to all the French regents demanded. You want to marry your son to the sole heiress of the entirety of the Luxemburg possessions? Sure, let's do that. We should jointly solve the schism by firing both popes. Yeah, let's go ahead. And so on, and so on, and so on. That is when the Prince Electors ran out of patience. This guy was not only useless, he was dangerous. So they looked round for a suitable anti-king. Their initial choice was Richard II of England. But Richard turned them down. Richard had some issues of his own that left him with only 2 more years on the throne and only 2 more years of life. After Richard's refusal, the Prince Electors decided to depose Wenceslas and elect one of their own. Deposing an elected and anointed king was, however, no easy task. Negotiations over whether and how to do it had been going on for almost a decade, before the archbishops of Cologne, Trier and Mainz gathered together with the Count Palatinate on the Rhine and took the plunge. In an elaborate and properly legalistic document, they list all of Wenceslas' crimes and shortcomings, all unbecoming his title as Roman king, and thereby justifying his removal. What is interesting about this document is not so much the fact that a king was deposed. That had happened several times before, most recently with Adolf of Nassau. But it is remarkable in as much as it tried to square this decision with the Golden Bull. Though the Prince Electors are aware that they are deviating from the Golden Bull, by referencing it, they reaffirm its status as the basic law of the empire. So, if anyone had won in all of this mess, it was the Golden Bull. The one who did not win in all of that was the man they elected to be Wenceslas' successor, Count Ruprecht of the Palatinate. Ruprecht was an extremely competent, sober man with a solid political instinct. He had been the dominant figure in the empire during Wenceslas' long absences. He had been the one engineering the Heidelberger Stallung and also the one who had freed Wenceslas from his Austrian jail. Putting together the coalition of Prince Electors that deposed Wenceslas was again very much his work. He and his father had been behind the few bits of imperial policy of that period that did actually work. And he had the right idea. He decided that he had to go down to Rome, get crowned emperor, and then could organize a new church council to end the schism. But what he had not counted on was Emperor Karl IV's great legacy: the stripping down of the imperial assets. Ruprecht simply did not have the money to do anything. His attempt to go to Rome was funded by German and Italian bankers, but ran aground when the Visconti, recently made dukes by Wenceslas, held him off at Brescia, long enough for his funds to run dry. So he had to return north. After that, he was broke. In tavern all across the land, he was made fun of as Ruprecht mit der leeren Tasche, Rupert of the empty pocket. He spent his remaining years on the throne in petty feuds with the Archbishop of Mainz and efforts to solidify his territories in the Palatinate. At least in the latter he was successful, and when he died in 1410, he left behind a consolidated territory along the Rhine, a land large enough to fund the construction of the castle of Heidelberg. Now, I've spent much of my youth in Heidelberg and so may be biased, but even as a ruin, it very much deserves its position as some of Germany's greatest tourist hotspots. If you get there, seek out Ruprecht's palace, the Ruprechtsbau, and impress people by knowing actually who he was and why he failed. When Ruprecht died in 1410, nobody seriously suggested that Wenceslas was still king. Another 10 years of fighting with Bohemian barons, murders, drunken debauchery, and ever deeper hatred of his brothers and cousins had left the king with barely more than an empty title that nobody recognized anymore. So a new king had to be elected. After the debacle of Ruprecht's kingship, the imperial princes knew better than to waste their wealth and reputation on this hopeless task. The only candidates were two other members of the Luxemburg family, Sigismund, the King of Hungary, and Jobst, the Margrave of Moravia. These were Wenceslas' closest relatives who had contributed as much to his downfall as his enemies had. But that is a story for another time. Next time, we will dig deeper into the Papal Schism, that great calamity of the 14th century that contemporaries thought was as terrifying as the plague. And whilst you wait, you may want to brush up on some of the early episodes where we discussed the backstory of how the church ended up in Avignon. That would be episode 92, Papal Epilogue. Or you may want to take a look at the state of papal affairs in episodes 144 to 148, when we talk about Henry VII, his rise to power as a papal champion in defiance of the King of France, and how he is then dropped by the papacy when things got too dicey. Or you can do something different and dive back in the grandeur of the great medieval emperors by listening to the whole season about Frederick Barbarossa. That is obviously available within this podcast and also as a separate podcast, again imaginatively called Frederick Barbarossa, which you can find wherever you find the history of the Germans. You can listen to all of these on historyofthegermans.com, where you can also support the podcast by signing up as a patron or by making a one-time donation.